Welcome back. In this video, I'd like to share with you a remarkable insight of the Ukraine war, Ukraine invasion. It was, an interesting article I came across on the BBC website, and I thought it's interesting to share with you, despite it's a bit long. So this is the article. Ukraine war. Putin has redrawn the world, but not the way he wanted. Vladimir Putin's invasion of Ukraine has changed the world. We are living in a new and more dangerous times. The post-Cold War era that began with the fall of the Berlin Wall is over. It is a rare thing to live through a moment of huge historical consequence and understand in real time what it is. In November 1989, I stood on a snow-flecked Wenceslau Square in Prague, the capital of what was then Czechoslovakia, and watched a new world being born. The peoples of the communist Eastern Europe had risen in defiance of the dictatorship. The Berlin Wall had been torn down. A divided Europe was being made whole again. In Prague, the dissident playwright Václav Havel addressed a crowd of 400,000 from a second-floor balcony. It was an exhilarating moment, dizzying in its pace. That evening, the communist regime collapsed, and within weeks, Havel was president of a new democratic state. I sensed, even at the time that I had watched the world pivot, that it was one of those rare moments when the world is remaking itself before your eyes. How many such moments had there been in the history of Europe since the French Revolution? Probably, I thought then, about 5. This 1989 was the 6th, but that word born in those dramatic popular revolutions came to an end when Putin ordered Russian forces into Ukraine. The German Chancellor Olaf Scholz called this moment a Zeitenwende, a turning point, while UK Foreign Secretary Liz Truss said it was a paradigm shift. The age of complacency, she said, was over. Queen Somerville, one of the BBC's most experienced war reporters, worked through the wreckage in Kharkiv recently and said of the Russian bombardment, if these tactics are unfamiliar to you, then you haven't been paying attention. He should know he spent enough time under Russian rockets in Syria to be paying very close attention. But the government of the democratic world, how much attention have they been paying to the nature of the Putin regime? The evidence has been building for years. 2 decades have passed since he sent troops into Georgia, claiming he was supporting breakaway region. Later, he sent spies into British cities armed with nerve agents to murder exiled Russians. In 2014, he invaded eastern Ukraine and annexed Crimea. Despite all this, Germany and much of the European Union were locking themselves into an unhealthy dependence of Russian gas. A year after the annexation of Crimea, they approved the building of a new pipeline, Nord Stream 2, to boost supplies. The complacency Liz Truss refers to also index around country. London had been a safe haven for Russian money since John Major was Prime Minister. Russian oligarchs have parked billions here, laundered their money, bought up the most prestigious private homes in the capital, socialized with the politicians, and donated to their campaign funds. Few questions were asked about where the vast wealth acquired so suddenly had come from. So, no, the Western democracy have not been paying attention to the nature of the menace that has been incubating on the eastern frontier. But Putin, too, has seemed complacent. First, he believed that the West was in chronic decline, weakened by internal division and ideological rancor. The election of Donald Trump and the Brexit is so a proof of this. The rise of a right-wing authoritarian government in Poland and Hungary was further evidence of the disintegration of liberal value and institution. The United States' humiliating withdrawal from Afghanistan was proof of a waning power withdrawing from the world stage. Second, he misread what was happening on his borders. He refused to believe that a series of democratic uprisings in former Soviet republics in Georgia in 2003, Ukraine in 2004 and 5, and Kyrgyzstan in 2005 could possibly be authentic expression of the popular will, because each was aimed at removing corrupt and unpopular pro-Moscow government. It seems self-evident to the Kremlin that these were the work of a foreign intelligence agency, the Americans and the British in particular. Western imperialism forward march into territory that was rightfully and historically Russia's. Third, he has failed to understand his own armed forces. It is clear now that he expected this special military operation to be over in a few days. Russia's military incompetence has astonished many Western security experts. It brings echoes, for me, of a smaller, more containable, but nonetheless devastating war in former Yugoslavia. In 1992, Serb nationalists launched war to strangle the newly independent state of Bosnia-Herzegovina. They argued that the Bosnian identity was bogus, that Bosnia statehood had no historical legitimacy, that it was really part of Serbia. It is exactly Putin's view of Ukraine. Like Russia today, Serb forces enjoyed overwhelming firepower superiority, but they often stall wherever local no-Serbs put up resistance. They seem unable to seize towns or cities, unwilling to fight street by street on foot. The Bosnian defenders were initially very poor equipped. I remember boys in tennis shoes in the trenches of Sarajevo, one with AK-47 between three of them, but they defended their capital for nearly 4 years. There is a similar resolve in the young men volunteer to defend Kiev. So, instead of attacking the city and towns, the Serbs laid siege to them, surrounding them, bombarding them, cutting off water, gas, and electricity. It is already happening in Mariupol. Besiege a city and cut off its water supply, And within 24 hours, every toilet is a public health hazard. Citizens have to go out into the street to find water, stand the pipes, and fill up receptacles just to flush they loose, cut off the electricity, and you freeze in your home apartment. Soon the food runs out. Is that what the Russians intended for Mariupol, Kharkiv, and Kiev? To serve them into submission? But nearly 4 years of this cruelty gave Bosnian nationhood a founding narrative of resistance, suffering, and heroic struggle. Ukraine's identity, too, will be strengthened further by the way Ukrainians have fought. Ukrainian Russian speakers have now felt liberated by the invasion. The evidence is that they too believe in Ukraine as a sovereign state. Putin's war aimed at the reunifying what he sees as two parts of the Russian nations is already having the opposite effect, strengthening the will of most Ukrainians to seek a destiny free from Russian domination. In 1994, while the war in the Balkans was still raging, the rest of Eastern Europe was looking to the future. Each nation eager to take what it was as its natural path in a Europe of independent sovereign states at peace with each other. But it was still far from certain that any of them would be allowed to join NATO. There was a debate back then about whether a third security bloc should be formed by the newly liberated Eastern European nation, so to act as a buffer between NATO and Russia. Russia was weak in the 1990s, and the nation that had endured Soviet occupation for 40 years did not trust it to stay weak for long. In the end, they wanted nothing short of NATO membership. Under President Bill Clinton, the United States pressed ahead with NATO expansion. The Russian President Boris Yeltsin, who saw himself as a loyal ally of Clinton's, was said to be furious when he found out at a press conference that NATO was planning to admit new members without consulting Moscow. And the tearing down of the Iron Curtain had raised a new question in geopolitics. How far east does the Western world extend? I was commissioned by the BBC to take a road trip to Poland, Belarus, and Ukraine to address the question, where is the eastern edge of the Western world now? I went to the hunting lodge in Belarus where, in late 1991, the president of the Russian Federation, Boris Yeltsin, and had met his counterpart from Ukraine and Belarus. Here, they agreed to recognize each other's Soviet republics as independent nation states. Then they rang the Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev and informed him that the country of which he was head of state, the Soviet Union, no longer existed. It was a moment fraught with both danger and opportunity. For Belarus and Ukraine, it was the chance to liberate themselves from Moscow rule, domination by Russian imperialism, both its Tsarist and Soviet forms. For Yeltsin, it represented the chance to liberate Russia too from its historic role as an imperial power. The UK and France had both ceased to be imperial powers after World War II. as Austria had done after World War I. In Turkey, Kemal Atatürk had built a modern European secular republic, a Turkish nation-state, after the multi-ethnic Ottoman Empire had been defeated and dismembered in 1918. Could Boris Yeltsin do the same thing, build a modern Russian nation-state at peace with its sovereign neighbors on the ruins of the Soviet Empire? In the early 1990s, he began this westernizing experiment to try to turn an imperial power into a democratic state. But the Rush, encouraged by the Western democracy eager to investment opportunities, to turn a sclerotic state-owned command economy into free market system was disastrous. It created gangster capitalism. A tiny elite became fabulously rich and plundering the asset of the major industry, especially oil and gas. The wheels finally came off the experiment in 1998. The economy collapsed. The ruble lost two-thirds of its value in a month, and inflation hit 80%. I stood with a middle-aged couple in a queue at Moscow Bank. They want to take their money out in dollars or pounds, anything other than rubles. The queue was long and slow-moving, and every few minutes a bank employee changed the display exchange rate as the ruble plunged further. People could see their life saving dropping in value by the minute. The couple got close to the head of the queue when suddenly the shutters came down. There was no cash left. I went to a former coal mining region near the Ukraine border where the mines were barely functioning. I met a graduate mining engineer who had lost his job, a man in his 30s with a young family. He took me to his dacha outside the city, which had about an acre of land. About 80% of what my family eat in the year, he said, I grow on this patch of land. The rest, like coffee and sugar, I barter for. I haven't used or even seen cash in about 18 months. Nothing spoke more powerfully about Yeltsin's failure to transform Russia than the sight of this highly educated man digging for his own dinner. Stalin turned a nation of peasants into an industrial superpower in a generation. Yeltsin is doing the same thing in reverse, he told me. Ordinary Russians felt robbed. The great westernizing experiment had been a con trick that had enriched a criminalized elite and impoverished everyone else. Many of the reports we filed from Russia at the time boiled down to a single question. What are the political consequences of the profound disenchantment that Russians now feel? The answer was that Russia eventually could revert to type, a retreat from democracy and a return to authoritarian rule, a retreat from nation statehood and a return to a more assertive imperial attitude to its near abroad, the countries that had previously been part of the Soviet Union. The former United States National Security Advisor Zbigniew Brzezinski famously said that Russia could be a democracy or an empire, but it could not be both. The Russia emblem, the double-headed eagle, looks both east and west. History has pulled Russia in opposing direction, democratic nation statehood in one direction and domineering imperial power on the other. Go to Petersburg, and you will see another aspect of this dual character. It is the country's beautiful bay window on the Gulf of Finland. It is an 18th century city facing west. It is European enlightenment in architectural form. Under the Tsar, it was the imperial capital. After the Russian Revolution in 1917, the Bolshevik moved the capital back to Moscow, and the power retreated behind the high crenellating walls of the Kremlin. It is the architecture of the defensiveness of suspicious, even fear. When Russian leaders look west from here, they see flat, open countryside rolling away to the south and west for hundreds of miles. There are no natural frontier. When I was the BBC Moscow correspondent in the late 1990s, there was a driver who could remember as a boy seeing German troops on the outskirts of Moscow in the 1940s. Every time he took us to Sheremetyevo airport, we would pass a monument designed to look like metal anti-tank defense, so-called Chizek and H-Ox. And he would say, this is how close they came, the Germans. Napoleon's army had gone further the previous century. That experience, that chronic sense of insecure western frontier, informs the way Russian leaders thought about the near abroad. In another conversation about the near abroad, a friend recited Riemann couplet to me. In Russia, it rhymes nicely, but in English it goes, a chicken's not really a bird, and the pollen's not really abroad. Russia's sense of what it is entitled to in the land of its west penetrates popular consciousness too. I will borrow an anecdote from another friend in Moscow at the time. The same driver picked her up from the airport and asked her where she had been. I've been for a weekend in Prague, she said. Oh, Prague, came the reply. That's good. That's ours. But it wasn't. The Berlin Wall had come down 9 years earlier, and the nations of Eastern Europe had ceased being ours, except Ukraine. Putin regards it's not a neighboring country, but as the frontier land of Russia itself, and he wants it brought back into the Russia fold. What would it take to do that? How can a nation that has put up so unified a resistance be subdued? Almost certainly he has overreached himself. Several factors must now be alarming him. The first is the state of his own armed forces. The second is the resilience of the Ukrainian defense. Did Putin really expect the Russian-speaking people of Ukraine to welcome his troops as liberators? Did he really believe that the uprising of 2014, which replaced the pro-Moscow government with one oriented to the West, was all a Western plot? If he did, then it reveals how little the Kremlin understands about its near abroad. But his biggest miscalculation has been to underestimate the resolve of the West. And this is what makes 2022 one of those pivotal years. The Zeiten went, in the words of Chancellor Scholz. Almost overnight, Germany has transformed its attitude to its role in the world. Traditionally reluctant for sound historical reasons to throw its weight around, it had preferred the exercise of soft power to throw its weight around. It had preferred The exercise of soft power too hard, not now. It has announced a doubling of defense spending and is sending lethal weapons to Ukraine. Gone too is the Ostpolitik, the decades-old Germany policy of seeking peace to engagement, especially trade. Germany, along with the rest of the democratic world, will now move to end its dependence of Russian gas. The Nord Stream 2 project is suspended, though not yet scrapped. We are seeing a root and branch redrawing of the map of the global energy distribution, aimed at cutting Russia out of it. Russia is highly integrated into the global economy, but now it has been expelled from the system the world uses to exchange payment for goods and services. Its industry, including oil and gas, depend on important goods and components. Soon production will grind to a halt. Employers will have to lay off their workers. Unemployment will rise. No one expected the West to sanction the Russia central bank already. The ruble had collapsed and interest rates have doubled. No other major economy has ever been subjected to a package of sanctions this punitive. It amounts to the expulsion of Russia from the global economy. More workers will be laid off. Major industry will find it hard to carry on. Unemployment will rise further. Soaring inflation will erode life saving. We will all be affected, potentially. This is the rolling back of the globalized economy that emerged after the end of the Cold War. The United States and the European Union have, in effect, divided the world up. Those states and companies that continue to trade with Russia will find themselves punished, also frozen out of trade with the rich world. It amounts to a new economic iron curtain separating Russia from the West. Much will depend on how China negotiate this new landscape. China and Russia are bounded by their shared antipathy to American power and their conviction that the greatest threat is from resurgent, more unified democratic world. China does not want Putin weakened or the West strengthened. Yet that is exactly the effect the war in Ukraine has had. Some China watchers believe Beijing will try to challenge the dominance of the dollar as a reserve currency, but carving out a distinct yuan zone as an alternative space in the global economy that can be protected from any future attempt by the United States to sanction China. Putin's war, therefore, could redraw the international financial map. But above all, this is a war that pits the world democracy against the world authoritarian regimes. It is also a war between two conflicting conceptions of the rules by which international relations should function. The Oxford scholar Timothy Garton Ash says these two world views can be expressed in short form by two words, Helsinki versus Yalta. At Yalta, in 1945, Stalin, Roosevelt, and Churchill carved the post-war Europe into spheres of influence. Most of Eastern Europe to Russia, the West to the transatlantic alliance that would see about rebuilding Europe's democracies. Helsinki, by contrast, describes a Europe of independent, sovereign state, each of which is free to choose its own alliances. This grew out of the Helsinki Final Act in 1975 and gradually evolved into the Organization for Security and cooperation in Europe. Ukraine's defenders are fighting for Helsinki. Putin has sent his troops in to impose a modern version of Yalta, which would kill off Ukraine's independence and leave it under Russian domination. Gartonash argues that the West has been too half-hearted in defending the value of Helsinki. That is, formally acknowledged Ukraine's right to join NATO at some unspecified date in the future without ever intending to make it happen. But Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky has signaled readiness to compromise on Helsinki principle by agreeing to abandon Ukraine's ambition to become a NATO member, with all the risk that entails. It may yet be the price Ukraine pays for the survival of its statehood. My generation grew up with the existential terror of the threat of the nuclear annihilation. The conflict has brought the fear back to public consciousness. Putin has threatened to use Russia's nuclear arsenal. That makes this most dangerous moment since the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. Then the Soviet Union shipped nuclear missiles to its ally Cuba. The United States assembled a fleet of ships to mount a seaborne invasion in the island. What the Americans did not know is that the Soviets didn't only have long-range strategic missiles. They also had smaller tactical nuclear missiles, so-called battlefield nuclear weapons, and that Soviet military doctrine delegated first use decision-making to commanders on the ground. Had the threatened invasion gone ahead, it would have triggered a nuclear exchange. Then the American Defense Secretary Robert McNamara only found out about this when the Soviet archive opened in 1991. Only then did he understand how close the world had come to catastrophe. In a remarkable film, Fog of War, 11 Lessons from the Life of Robert McNamara, he explained how the world had avoided destroying itself. Was it skilled diplomacy? Wise leadership? No. Luck, he said. We lucked it out. That experience, now fading from memory, should focus minds. And this is the article I want to share with you. Thank you for watching. See you next time.